Welcome to the Safe Business Agility Podcast. This is the place to get advice, stories, perspectives, and updates about safe and related topics to help you work differently and build the future. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Business Agility Podcast, we're joined by Gez Smith from C Prime. Gez is a great guy. Among all of the cool things he does, one of the things he's most interested in is making dealing with regulatory and compliance issues within banks less of a thing and something that can actually turn into some pretty cool relationships. So Gez talks us through his experience. He talks through some of the IP that he's developing and in a survey that you can participate in now to help drive the future development of IP creation related to regulatory and compliance. I hope you enjoy this one with Gez. Check him out on social. He's a real fun guy. Enjoy. All right, we are here at Safe Summit Prague, our first time back in Europe since The Hague in 2019 or 20. I don't remember the year. Gez, do you?
It was when I just had my second child. It was 2019. Yeah, it was my first time out away from home with a baby.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you about that date. You're going to know it a heck of a lot better than I do. Anyway, Gez, welcome. Thanks for hanging out.
Thank you for having me. Definitely.
Great. Well, do you want to give yourself a quick introduction to the folks that are tuning in?
Yeah, I'm Gez. I'm an SPCT. Been working in the Agile space, I think, for like 20 years now or something absurd like that. And I kind of specialize in regulated environments, especially banks. I found myself quite enjoying the world of financial services.
Wait, what?
I know.
I think you might be the only consultant in the space that's really jazzed to work at banks and insurance is up there too.
It's really strange, but I work on contracts and people kind of go, oh, this place is crazy. And I go, no, it's not. It's great. I love it. It's fine. So something about me and banks seems to work. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about that. What is it about you and banks what is it about that environment that gets you excited?
Well, I worked at startups for a long time and I saw the potential of what Agile can do in really, really interesting creative spaces. And that was a lot in the government space. And for me, the opportunity in financial services to turn them from big, lumbering, heavily regulated places where people wear suits, the opportunity to kind of break them and turn them into interesting, innovative places that deliver amazing products that delight their customers is vast, absolutely vast. And people are generally up for it. People are generally quite excited about that kind of thing. So I think it's the challenge and the opportunity that it provides is quite exciting.
You know, I'm sitting here giving you a hard time about banks because I think, we talk to a lot of people that work in those spaces and it's kind of formal in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of similar problems. There's a lot of formality. And then I'm thinking about my own journey as a consultant. And I think two of the coolest gigs I had were actually in a bank, though they consider themselves a fintech. One was the organization had leased really expensive space in high income areas, thinking that was a good way to draw people in. And then they quickly realized that these customers don't want to come to a branch. They're using their phone. So we went ahead and we launched an art or a few arts. And it was one of the first that I had done in a non-tech space. And we converted those very expensive pieces of commercial real estate bank branches into cafes.
Nice.
So that was really cool.
Yeah.
And then after that, one of the other folks on my team was working to manage ATM distribution.
Oh, yeah.
Which was it's basically a big Kanban with some video cameras. Like it was a really cool gig. Okay, so I take it back. There's some really cool stuff that happens in banks.
There can be. And some really cool people too. Yeah. People genuinely seem to care in financial services. So they have this image of kind of evil bankers, but actually I've never met someone who doesn't genuinely want the best outcome for their customers in that space.
Well, that's very true. And I think the only people that get the bad reputation or like where people get kind of weird when you talk about banks is when they talk about regulatory and compliance.
Absolutely.
Wait, have you heard that before? You've gone into a bank or an insurance company that said, well, we can't because regulatory, we can't because compliance. That's not the way the regulators say. Have you ever run into that?
Absolutely. My kind of good friend who I do a lot of training with in financial services, my friend and I have this thing where it's just the little catch-all phrase that just says, but we're a bank. Because you run training sessions and you're halfway through and someone puts their hand up and goes, but we're a bank. And I go, cool, I'm a Gez. I mean, what's your point? I don't know what difference that possibly makes. You're a large organization that works in a regulated environment. You're not unique. But somehow these places have this mindset of, oh no, couldn't possibly do that. The regulator will come down on us. The regulator will do something. And it's funny, actually, because my epiphany moment in this space was about 5 years ago in Geneva. I met someone from the UK regulator and I was chatting to him and I basically said, look, you're the reason we can't have nice things. You're the reason that none of this works because the regulator. And he went, it's absolutely nothing to do with us. We give you a bunch of outcomes to meet. How you meet those outcomes, you decide that. And if the way you're meeting your outcomes is through heavyweight, complex regulatory processes that are really painful, that's on you. That's not on us.
You know, it's funny. I had a similar conversation with a regulator, and I think the synopsis is basically the same, except they said, we don't really care what you do as long as you do it the same way every time, right? They look for consistency in how you get to your outcomes and how you report. I mean, there's obviously, depending on the bank and the specific regulator you're talking to, in the US, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission. I mean, there's regulations that are there, that are in place. My favorite is, it might be Regulation 1, and it goes back to the days of stagecoaches. And it says that if you are a bank teller, every 10 days, you have to take an unscheduled day off, because there were people that worked in the banks that were facilitating the robbery of stagecoaches. And they thought if these people were just off randomly, that might break the chain of stagecoach robberies. So that's like rule 1 for the Banking Regulatory Commission. But it's, you know, there's things you must do. And then there's things that they check just for consistency. And I think a similar pattern in other organizations is where they have approval thresholds. Like, so I worked in an organization where any project that was going to make or save $20 million was automatically approved. And when you know, every project made or saved $20 million, nobody ever checked, right? So, but that's just what that was just the mantra that they ran to. And I think in banks, the words because regulatory, because compliance, people aren't going to argue with that, right? If somebody says, we'll do this because regulatory, people are just going to fall in line and do it because nobody wants to question the regulator.
Absolutely. I was talking to a friend at a UK bank last week, funnily enough, up in Manchester in England. And he was basically saying that, yeah, if someone turns up with something regulatory, it can Leroy Jenkins its way through the entire delivery and everything else gets forced out of the way. Whether it's the right thing to do, the wrong thing to do, it makes economic sense, whatever, you just wave the regulatory flag and suddenly everyone has to do your thing, which isn't necessarily helpful when you're applying systems thinking and trying to make the overall system kind of work, that people can just barge their way through with this stuff.
Yeah, that's that whole mentality of I'm going to win at all costs.
Yeah.
And it's not really productive, right?
No, completely.
So, Gez, I know you have a lot of experience in this space and you've done a lot of work and you've kind of made it, you know, your pseudo passion project. So what is it that you've learned in this space that gets you especially excited? Because, I mean, it's interesting enough to hear you say banking, well, those are my favorite clients. And then it's even more interesting to hear you say, especially regulatory.
Yeah, I think it was this moment where I was working at a very large bank and we were rolling out Safe and we were literally bootstrapping it from nothing. We were just myself, a laptop and my friend Rick, and we were giving it a go. And so many times people would attend the training and then say, oh, but we're a bank and we've got to do all of this sort of stuff. So Rick and I eventually went, look, we'll go and talk to the bank's regulatory team. We'll go and work this out. And we ended up spending about 6 months sitting down with them, going through all of their processes that people had to follow and all their regulatory stuff. And the more we talked to them, the more we realized that actually we were saying the same stuff. They, I think, had something called tranches and we had something called program increments at the time. But they were basically the same thing. They were 12-week chunks of work that you had to plan on a quarterly basis. And we went, well, you know what? If we followed Safe, wouldn't we be doing your thing too? And they went, you pretty much would. And we accidentally became the bureaucracy. We realized that you could match Safe and the bank's regulations really, really well to the point that we were suddenly the thing to do. And then we explained this to some very senior leaders and they said, well, it sounds like everyone needs training in this Safe thing, doesn't it? How many people do you want to train? And I kind of put my little finger in the corner of my mouth and just went, I want 1,000 training licenses. And they went, great, here you go. Train 1,000 people. And I was like, oh, crikey, well, there we are then. And then people in the training would say, but the regulations. We say, no, this is now the regulations. You follow this stuff, you're basically following the regulations. I think there were 5 differences we found, and they were all very specific things that obviously wouldn't be in Safe. You know, Sarbanes-Oxley cross-border compliance document. And we just said, well, put that through your board, evidence that you delivered that check, and you're good to go. Yeah.
Well, sure. Those things just become constraints then, NFRs, right? Yeah. I mean, so Safe isn't going to tell you how to do everything. It is, after all, a framework. And then you apply that framework to your context with intent. And it sounds like, you know, you all fell backwards into that, you know, perfectly well,
yeah.
Right? You know, you took the objection of we can't do this because, you went to the because, and they said, oh, this actually is going to make it easier to do what we want to do. And by golly, we'll be able to move faster.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it really, really worked. So that was my first kind of epiphany of that kind of working. But then you also realise just the far-reaching impacts that regulatory work can have on customer experiences. If you look at something like Conway's Law, where you ship your org chart, the thing you deliver looks like your organisation. If your regulatory requirements become this invincible behemoth that can never be argued with, then actually you're letting your regulatory team design your products. Are they trained to do that? Is that their skill set? Possibly not. And yet by accident we're falling into this. So then you have to start looking at kind of, well, maybe we need to bring them more in. Maybe we need to bring them into our value streams so they understand what we're trying to achieve. We understand what they're trying to achieve and onwards from there. I had one once where a regulatory person, I was trying to get them to attend PI planning. And they said, well, I can maybe do an hour at the start, if I have to. And then at the end of day 2, they were still there running around talking to everyone, going, you can't do that. I didn't know anything about this. What's going on here? They even had their own row on the board, their own swim lane on the board. And they were taking other people's work and going, who put this up? We can't do this. Completely bought in by the end of it. So often, as with all of these problems, it's just about facilitating a conversation and stop seeing it as us and them and just seeing it as us together,
Those are absolutely valid points. And I think there's so many examples of the power of PI planning, especially among the resistors. It's the ones that often resist the most who end up getting the most out of it in the visualization, right? Why are we still doing this? What is this thing that we're doing? It's interesting stuff. So what is your experience when the internal auditors and the internal regulators have to interface with the external? So they've started working this way. They've started creating their documents and their reports in this way. How do the audits go for them? Was there any difference? Was it easier? Was it harder? How do those conversations go?
Honestly, done well, I think they end up finding it easier because SAFE especially and this whole Agile thing more broadly, a lot of it is about transparency. And the regulators just want transparency. They want to be able to go, you know what, we have confidence that you are doing the right things in the right way and implementing the things we need you to. So rather than having to run around as a person being audited and say, great, we need to scrape everything together, what happened here, who knows what's going on here. I'm sure we've all been in last minute meetings with senior leaders where they go, we've got to report in an hour. What have we got? I don't know. Suddenly by having all of this transparency and this clear sort of, well, here's our board for this particular PI, this particular quarter, this is what we did, this is why, this is where these documents are kept, just makes it so much easier, almost a kind of tick box exercise of we've already got it. Here it is. Any questions?
So can you take me through that, Gez? If we start with, let's say, an epic of any kind, right? It could be a new development. It could be maintenance, whatever. At what levels do the regulators contribute to, say, the architectural runway in terms of, here's the guidance of what we need to do? And at what levels does that roll back up to say, here's the traceability to the work that we did do to satisfy the intent that you gave us? Like, what does that look like? How do those interactions work?
It depends on how, I wouldn't say mature, but how well structured the organization is, because typically what tends to happen is regulator turns up with some new requirements, that gets formed into a whole new program of work. That program of work bulldozes its way through all the existing programs of work, because typically regulation will touch multiple different products, multiple different offerings and services. So it bulldozes its way through as a program of work. And because it's a program of work, people have confidence, A, that it's being delivered, but B, that they can then evidence what happened because it was all one thing. That, though, causes massive systemic collisions and impacts across the organization and really, really messes a lot of things up very often. So what tends to happen better is when organizations already have, for example, well-established arts, well-established backlogs for them, and then you can just take that big regulatory change and decompose it down and filter it down through the different parts of the systems in whatever way suits best, and then roll it back up again. But that does require that organization to have the structures to cope with that. Otherwise, that single program regulatory change will bulldoze its way through everything else.
And so with that, how do you, Agile principle number 10, that body of work, how do you maximize the art of the amount of work not done when it comes to regulatory stuff? Because I think what I've seen in the past is, when these regulatory things come through, there's the stuff we have to do, and then the other stuff we're going to throw in there because if it's attached to this, we know it's going to get done. So as we decompose that work, how do we identify the things that must get done versus the things that don't necessarily need to get done? And what's your experience with sometimes you just pay the darn fine? I mean, I know there was one example I saw where I want to say it was something like the entire art, a year's worth of capacity to avoid a $500 a month fine. And it would take something like 10 years to break even. So you just paid the fine.
Yeah. I mean, there's two big things there, really. One is the whole assume variability, preserve options element, where quite often you're moving through a regulatory change and then the regulator gets in touch, said, actually, we've just changed our mind. We want to do this instead. And people sit there going, well, good grief, we've just done loads and loads of work now we've got to throw away. So approaching it with that mindset of quite often the regulatory change is quite fluid and still evolving because it's coming down from a place like government that is quite fluid and evolving very often. So doing as little as possible before you commit too far can really, really help with the fact that regulations very often change as they're going through. But WSJF has also been a hugely powerful tool in this. I mean, I was training 1,000 people in this particular instance and training everyone in WSJF, blah, blah, blah. And then a few of the senior leaders that I trained probably a year ago came back to a subsequent course. And when we were talking about it, one of them put the hand up and said, oh, this was really useful for us. And I went, oh, great, thank you. As a trainer, my ego thanks you. And they went, no, seriously, we had a regulatory thing turned up. We looked at the economics of it. And we realised it was much cheaper to pay the fine than try and throw 1 million people at it to hit their particular deadline. So we contacted the regulator and said, you know what, lovely suggestion. We're not doing it just yet. We're going to pay your fine instead and we'll do it a bit later. And I had that weird moment going, wow, you really listened to me and you really did something that I suggested. And it really worked. And it was a brave move for the culture of that organisation because typically it'd been very much like, oh, good grief, we just have to meet the regulations. Come hell or high water, when actually, like you say, it made far more economic sense just to pay the fine, do it a bit later. No one died.
Yeah, and I feel like you can tell based on the history of a company what you're going to walk into, right? So if you go into an organization that has had a history of non-compliance and it was maybe a thing that showed up on the Wall Street Journal, you know, they'll have edicts such as be compliant at all costs. And sometimes I think people say that with the right intent, but they don't really realize what all costs really mean, right? And I think that's an important distinction. Like we have to look at the economics of this thing. How long is it going to take us to break even on the potential fine?
Yeah.
Now there's obviously other categories, right? Sometimes it would be a cease and desist. You can't do business anymore unless you are compliant with this thing. And then there's sometimes that there's really darn big fines and you got to get it done. And those are the sorts of conversations that we have. And we have to look at it. You know, it can't just be that it's regulatory, therefore it goes to the top. It's if you have this thing that's going to make you a lot of money, or this fine that's going to cost you some money, well, what's the economics? Like, what are you going to make with this new thing versus what are you going to lose with this regulatory thing? And we need to be able to have those conversations. And I think in a lot of banks, that's the cultural element that needs to shift. We can talk about these things. It's not a rubber stamp just because you said the magic regulatory word, or the magic compliance word. It's still a conversation. There's still economics involved. And there's also the piece of, you know, maybe it's not a big cost, but what's the risk in terms of reputation, right? But just like everything else we discuss, right? There's multiple aspects to value, and there's the same thing in regulatory, right? There's different pieces to it. There's different perceptions. There's different costs, and all of these things need to be discussed in relation to the other items in the backlog.
And I sometimes think as well, by making regulatory work so incredibly world-beatingly, this is important, you actually somehow sometimes damage your ability to meet regulatory work. I mean, to give an example, I was working at a bank once where I had to do mandatory training every 3 months in what to do in the event of an armed robbery. And I was working in a very nice office, not even slightly customer facing. The chances of me getting armed robbery on the second floor past multiple layers of security were basically zero. And I remember saying to someone, why am I being trained in how to respond to an armed robbery? And they said, well, there was a regulatory thing where they wanted everyone to make sure the bank was compliant against this particular type of incident. So the bank rolled out mandatory training for everybody. And I was like, but it shouldn't have applied to me. And they said, yeah, but they just wanted to show the regulator they'd done it. And it was a tick box thing. There's the old joke about mandatory training in large organizations, especially banks very often, where the training in the regulatory requirements is all online. And you have a game where you play with yourself, like, how quickly can I click through the slides without reading them? and then answer the questions at the end and pass the test even without learning anything, which I think it's almost like fire alarm syndrome. It's almost kind of like you run a fire alarm often enough, people start to ignore it. And that, again, is a blanket one-size-fits-all to things rather than a considered approach that might actually mean people engage with this regulatory stuff on a better basis.
That's a great point. And there's the reciprocal to that, which is the companies that provide that training, right? Oh, hey, if you want to get by, on this particular requirement, well, for $19.95 per person, we can make that an easy pass for you. And they're like, sweet, let's give it to everybody. And then the person that sold it's like, yes, new boat. So there's all kinds of different motivators in these things. And at the end of it, for the individual line employee, middle manager, we just want to do the right thing and be compliant. You say, if I do this training, we're compliant, sweet, let's do it. In the back of our heads, we're like, this is ridiculous. But at the same time, someone has to have the courage to stand up and say why, and to challenge and to say, well, what's the cost of this? How much are you charging per seat for this robbery training? It takes everybody 2-3 hours. Well, how much is this really costing us? Is there a better way? And I think the economics of compliance, again, those are conversations that I don't know if we've been afraid to have, or if we haven't had the visibility to have an informed conversation from those perspectives. But hey, this is all about transparency. This is all about economics. So how do we get that information? How can we say yes or no to something without that data?
Exactly. And I think so often senior leaders, they're just incredibly busy people who don't see their kids enough. And if someone can turn up and say, for this much money, this headache for you goes away, you can say to the regulator, we've ticked the box, job done. They go, brilliant, I get an extra half an hour with my kids. And that's a really human thing you can't really fight. So trying to have a conversation with them sometimes about, could this be done in a better way? That sounds like more work than just ticking a box. Another thing we did that I found actually shifted the conversation really well with senior leaders and with people was to say, look, this isn't about there's your work and there's the regulatory stuff you have to do. Actually, the regulatory stuff is essentially a quality standard. It's some quality standards you have to meet because the regulator has come up with these things that protect your customers. You should take a pride in meeting the regulations, just like you take a pride in the quality of your code and the user experience and the designs and staying on your brand guidelines and all that sort of stuff. So what we started to do as well was shift the conversation from this is regulatory to this is just part of your definition done. These are your quality standards. And people kind of got that because people care about the quality of their work very often. So folding it all in together and not saying there is regulatory and not regulatory, there's just general quality standards, some of which happen to come from this regulatory source, really shifted that mindset and shifted that conversation as well.
So what are your perspectives on this idea of proactive compliance? So sometimes when I've worked with banks in the past, I've created an impact assessment working with change management for new epics and sometimes features. And we'd go through and we'd have a discussion of, to do this new thing, who does it touch? Do we need to go talk to facilities? Do we need to go talk to information security, app arc, whoever, right? And for those heavily regulated organizations, well, compliance was on there. Right. So as we start formulating the idea, and I liked what you said earlier about how our designs and experiences kind of mimic our culture for compliance. So if you have those people involved in the beginning, right, and you start thinking proactively, here's this cool new thing that we want to do. How do we make it as cool and as secure and as compliant as possible proactively? Right. We're not going at the end saying, hey, here's this thing I did. Is it okay? But we've solutioned together. We've created with intent our epics and our features to be compliant, right? And we've created it with elegant design. So have you had a lot of experience or much experience engaging regulators proactively, or has it always been they tell us that we need to fix this thing and we check to see if this thing that we've built is okay?
Yeah, massively. And I tend to take the view that if something's difficult, you should do it more often. And very often people kind of go, oh, this regulatory, we don't want to talk to them. If we engage them, they're going to come and talk to us and they're going to say things we don't understand and they're going to tell us we can't do the fun things and it's all just going to be horrible. And you have to say to people, no, look, seriously, it's much easier to get them involved at the start. Make friends with them, get to know what they want. Because the more you do, as we found when we were matching SAFE with a regulatory framework, the more you do, the more you realise you're all on the same team, you're all on the same page, and you all want this to happen. And there was a very interesting example I came across a couple of months ago, chatting to someone I used to work with a long time ago, where they said, we've had a consultancy in and we've massively dropped the size of the work we're pushing out into production. One of their big recommendations was to reduce our batch size. But we hadn't changed any of the compliance sign-off processes. So actually everything started taking an awful lot longer and costing an awful lot more, because rather than going through that process once with a big batch, we hadn't reduced our transaction cost. So we then had to go through the same heavy weight process for 10 pieces of work, and it slowed everything right down. If only we'd spoke to them at the start and said, look, if we get you involved early, can we then reduce the transaction cost at the end? They almost certainly would have said, yes, of course you can. Would have seen it. The sign-off will be a formality at that point. It would have worked. So often people try and hide from that problem and find it hurts them far more than if they'd met it head on at the start.
I feel like you've just said so much we should.
What, about me personally? Or?
I mean, it could go a lot of ways. So when we start talking about, well, if I just would have done that thing proactively, it would have hurt a lot less in the long run. I mean, we could go 100 ways about that, and 100 things we should be doing that we're probably not doing.
Yeah.
But then also, I think the most important thing, and I say this a lot, and I'm going to continue to say it because it's really important. And it's that SAFe isn't going to tell you specifically what to do. It's going to give you guardrails. It's going to give you context. It's going to give you intent. And largely, and no matter the context that you're working in, how heavily regulated, how heavily compartmentalized, or a startup, it all comes down to people. It all comes down to relationships and your ability to talk to people. And I think, for me personally, when I first started working in an Agile context, it was hard for me because as an architect, I really liked to be left alone. Like as a good old boy engineer, leave me alone. Like I want to sit here, I want to work, and don't talk to me. And then as we started moving faster, there was a direct correlation between our speed and the level of interaction I had to have with other humans. And in the beginning, I didn't like that. Now we're sitting here and we're having a casual conversation, recording a podcast. I clearly got over it, right? And I talk for a living. But that's it. It all comes down to people, right? All of these things are about making the broader royal we better, right? So the we of our organization, the we of our world. We want to move faster. We want to deliver customer-centric solutions. We want to deliver high-fidelity solutions. But we can't do any of that if we don't talk and have a common understanding. And to your point, that means having the hard conversations now, overcoming the biases that we all have, such as the regulators are hard to deal with. I used to have this perception that legal was hard to deal with and that finance was hard to deal with. And guess what? I have so many friends that are lawyers now, and I've had so much fun with people who are accountants because, at the end of the day, they want to go out and have fun because their job isn't super exciting throughout the day. They're just people. And I think a lot of the times we put these barriers in our own paths that we don't want to talk to people because of some fake reasons. Whereas if we just go have a conversation, buy them a coffee, your life is instantly that much better.
There's a classic example of that. A friend of mine at a very large bank, probably 10 years ago now, they were rolling out Agile coaches left, right and centre, to the point that every part of the organisation had to have an Agile coach. And this friend got dropped into the audit team and very openly said at the start, oh, good grief, I'm working with the auditors. I can't believe this is so boring. But he did something amazing because he got them so excited about this Agile thing that they realised the huge amount of risk tied up in very large batch sizes and very heavyweight processes. And so his auditors then became his transformation team because they went around failing any team that wasn't Agile, that wasn't applying small batch sizes and so forth. So by turning that around in his own head from, oh, I've picked a really bad card here, to, these are human beings too, and they're probably quite interesting people, he genuinely created his own private army of change agents who had such authority because they were the auditors. And I think this is a broader piece as well sometimes where people say, we're rolling out SAFe or we're rolling out whatever we're rolling out. That doesn't mean it's going to get rolled out. You still have to go and do the hard work of going and talking to people and winning hearts and minds and explaining to them why this is the right thing to do. Just because someone senior has said something doesn't mean it's going to happen.
That's kind of the beginning part of the Cotter change model, right? You've got to create your compelling vision, over communicate it, and then build a community of advocates to support you, right?
Absolutely.
You can have the best ideas in the world, but without energy and people willing to support you, you're not going to go anywhere.
Completely.
Right? I think we've seen, I know I've seen it in my career, and I'm sure you've seen it through yours, where change is mandated, right? Well, the CIO or the COO said, we have to do this new way of working. And then they give that edict and they check out, right? And that's not how you lead change. You're not going to inspire anybody. You're not going to be there to lead through the hard times, right? We've got to do the hard work.
Or you cause more damage by making people kind of do a tick box exercise to the change. I remember once with a safe rollout, a team coming to me and saying, we want to adopt PR planning. And I said, fantastic, I'm a bit busy. Maybe in a couple of months I can come and do your training and your art launch and so forth. And then I saw them the next week and they said, oh, don't worry, we've done it. I said, really? They said, yeah, we've done a much better version. It only took an hour, just had the team leads, we worked it all out. And I went, well, can you please not call that PR planning at least? Because that's not PR planning. But because they said they'd done PR planning, they got ticked off on the sheet as they're done and on to the next one. So, you know, you have to apply your quality standards to any sort of framework and approach you're applying as well. And that takes work and that takes time. But you have to allow the time for it because the results you get from applying that time and that diligence are so much better in the long run.
Kind of sounds like the crash diet version of getting in shape.
Absolutely.
We're going to go ahead and we're going to train 98% of the staff. We're going to do PI planning, and we've moved our projects into features that are still projects. And then we're done. We bought the Agile.
Yeah, we renamed everything and off we go.
And then we're going to be mad when we don't get any different of an outcome.
Yeah.
And people are still frustrated.
Completely. Or it's just seen as a development thing and the rest of the organization can carry on doing what it's always done. And especially where you get a senior leader who sponsors the change in one part of the organization and kind of goes, well, I don't deal with the regulatory work. I don't deal with compliance. I don't run the audit teams. That's that person over there. And they look after their world. You know, people like saying the word world in these things. That's so-and-so's world over there, as if somehow they're part of a universe where they're all alien to each other. So they end up kind of saying, well, that's someone else's world. I'm not going to touch that. When actually you have to.
And that's so unfortunate because when we start looking at value management, right? Everything touches everything. Like you can't be successful in an organization and delight a customer if you don't deal with the entire system. And I think to your point earlier where you mentioned that the solution kind of mirrors the culture, it mirrors the environment. And you see that too. Like you can look at solutions and if the people in the organization are all aligned, you can see it clearly in the solution, right? Like you can have part of your banking app, right, that's maybe amazing, but then you can't transfer between one account and another because those two executives didn't talk to each other and that one person dinged that other person's car in the parking lot and we're just frustrated. It comes back to what we said earlier. It's about relationships, right? The system is a representation of the relationships.
Yeah, completely.
So what do we do about this stuff, Gez? I know we've gone down some rabbit holes, which is what I kind of do. So what's your solution when you go into a bank and you go into these organizations and you have this regulatory and compliance solution? What does that look like? How do you position it? What are those conversations?
So it's hard to say in a way because I generally say start where you are. Start with what you've got and don't try and poke things too much because there are various things you can poke and people will go, oh, that's interesting. You know, a team stands up in the morning and has a whiteboard with some sticky notes. Brilliant. Yeah, great. I'm glad I paid for your consultancy at this point. But you go and poke at regulatory work and everyone goes, no, stay away from that. That is regulatory. You are not allowed to touch that. So be very careful around it at the start. But just go and have coffee with people. Go and speak to those regulators and then maybe come back to the people that are saying no. Don't go and talk to them and say, well, I did talk to them. I just happened to meet them. And actually they're really interested in having a conversation about this and bringing them in. Each instance has to be done differently. Obviously, context matters, but very much kind of a slow and gentle approach to stuff because this is scary for people. This is stuff that might lose them their jobs, and their jobs are how they feed their kids, and they want to keep on feeding their kids, understandably. So being very careful around it. But at the same time, finding ways to at least start making this work, understanding the structures you need to have regulatory work feed in without car crashing its way through everything else you're doing. Getting that set up, because you can see that's going to keep on happening, can be one really useful thing to do. If they still insist on having a regulatory program as some separate thing from all the other work that's happening, then at least try and get that regulatory program working in an agile way so it's ready to start merging in with the other value streams as things get more mature. And also demonstrating wins, because so often regulatory work there's that classic phrase of, we got it over the line, as if somehow this was an incredibly difficult thing to do and everyone should get medals and purple hearts and so forth for getting this thing done. At least you can start saying, well, that regulatory work that normally took a year, did it in 3 months. Any questions? And then people start to go, well, this is really interesting. What do we do more around this space? So demonstrate it can be done. Demonstrate some early wins. Again, that cost of change model we talked about earlier can be really, really useful. But also, I think understanding the patterns for this, because there are some common patterns. There are some things you can do. What they all are yet, I don't know. But I'm confident there are patterns and behaviours that are pretty common across most regulated environments that hopefully we can start sharing with each other and we can start learning from each other as well.
I love that. So in your experiences, I assume that you've worked in multiple countries on this sort of work.
Yeah.
Do you notice any glaring differences, or is it pretty much the same, right? So the regulations might be different, but then the root cause is the same, the approach is similar, or is it dramatically different from one environment to the next?
I would have said it's reasonably similar to a greater or lesser degree in most countries until I did some Safe Exec workshops in Dubai. And we were running the exec workshop fantastically well, loads of really engaged senior leaders. It's a workshop I kind of like losing control of, because then they start talking to each other. Or maybe if you did this, then I could do this and we could do those things. And it was all going really, really well. And then we played the decentralizing decision-making video. And I came back and everyone just had arms folded staring at us. And it was just tumbleweed in the room. I pulled out all my facilitation skills, like 10 minutes of me walking in the middle of the room, picking on people, blah, blah. And eventually we just had to say, okay, well, I guess you can go then. And they all just got up and walked out of the room. I said, what was that? And it turns out in that particular environment, regulatory work and the penalties for it are seen far more severely on a personal level than in other environments. And I was not aware of that at that point. So it can be somewhat context specific in different countries. But I think fundamentally the answers are still the same. Once people start talking to each other, they start to understand that actually they're all kind of on the same team. It's the only part of an organization or any element of an organization I work with that really inspires genuine fear in people. That's probably at the heart of what it can be.
You know, you bring up a good point that I think it's a lesson that any of us that have been consultants and have gone international have learned the hard way, right? And that's culture trumps everything. And there's guides that are available that are out there that can talk to you about how to interact with people, basic customs, words not to say, lines not to cross. I learned that hard lesson in Mexico. I learned that hard lesson in Israel. I learned that hard lesson in some Middle Eastern countries. And it was 100% my ignorance, right? Just you don't know what you don't know, and you think you're being funny until everyone walks out of the room, right? So I think that that's good for everybody. I think that's, you know, outside of the conversation of regulatory and compliance, it's just make sure you understand the room that you're walking into. And I think every organization's got a different culture and different personalities, but countries and cultures around the world are something that we all need to be aware of. And I mean, like I said, I'm not picking on you because oh boy, I've done some boneheaded things in my career. And I think the only reason I'm sitting in this chair and like I've done pretty well is because I've done boneheaded things and I've shared those lessons broadly. Like I don't hide them. I tell everybody I've screwed up more than most people I know. It's part of my charm.
I think failure is awesome because you learn from it. Failing the same way twice, that's bad. Failing, every time I fail, I go, wow, that was a fascinating learning. I mean, generally when I'm going to a new country, I'll try and speak to someone local and say, what are the things I should understand here? And to be fair, we did that in Dubai. You know, you don't offer a woman your hand to shake. She will either offer you a hand or she won't. And both of those things are fine. Not a problem at all. We were very, very careful with that stuff. But then, yeah, there was a huge one around regulatory stuff we just hadn't expected. So, yeah.
I heard that speeding is really bad in Dubai. Don't do that. Don't get caught. Their cars are faster than yours. I think they use Lamborghinis as police cruisers.
Yeah, they have.
You will lose.
It was a beautiful country in many ways.
It's gorgeous. I've had great experiences there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Gez, you're doing a little bit of work right now that's more community focused around this space. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've been doing this for a few years and I've got my own ideas, my own patterns and my own kind of things I think work. But that always scares me because the more you have your own ideas, the more you become convinced of your own ideas and the more you could be heading down completely the wrong track with a whole bunch of nonsense. So what I want to do now is kind of stop having my ideas and start getting other people's ideas. I'm running a short survey at regulatorygility.com, which basically gives people 10 kind of regulatory challenges and asks them to prioritize them like a backlog. Which of these are your biggest problems? Which of them are not? And then if people just want to do the survey, great. But what I'd also like to do is to start having more structured kind of interviews and conversations with people around their actual experience of this and how they solve these problems. I'm doing a talk at the SAFE Summit in Nashville later this year, where I'll be presenting the results of this finding in the hope that other people can benefit from it too, that other people can kind of turn up and say, well, I've learned some stuff that I can bring back to my organization to help start fixing these problems. I think some of my ideas work because I've used them and they've worked, but I'm not confident that they're going to be amazing until I've heard from other people as well. So I'd really like to hear from as many other people as possible around their experiences of dealing with regulatory challenges and overcoming them as well.
That's great, Gez. Can you tell us again, where can folks find that survey?
Most certainly. So www.regulatoryagility.com.
That sounds like it's easy enough to find.
I do hope so, yes.
I hope so too. Well, Gez, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything you would like to leave our Business Agility Podcast friends with before we sign off?
Don't panic. That Douglas Adams phrase, don't panic. If the regulator turns up, the auditor turns up, something like that happens, this is fixable, this can work. Other people have been in your situation. It should not be some sort of stoppage to your agility, to your safe journey. In fact, if anything, if you treat it right, it can be a massive bonus to it. So embrace it, love it, and learn to love it in the way I did.
Fun fact, the doorbell to my house says don't panic. Gez, thank you so much for making the time. Let's do a follow-up in Nashville. Let's learn about the results of that survey. One more time, where can people find you and your survey?
Fabulous. So www.regulatoryagility.com.
And you?
And me, I'm just Gez, man. Gez Smith. If you look for someone with Gez or Gez Smith, sorry, and with a slightly ridiculous haircut on LinkedIn, you can find me there. There aren't many of us.
Gez, I appreciate the convo, man. Enjoy the rest of the summit, or the beginning, I guess.
Indeed. Have a fabulous summit.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. The entire team at Scaled Agile is focused on helping you be better at work so that you can help your enterprise be more successful in the new age of business. If there's anything else we can do to help, if there are any other assets you'd like to see, content, podcast guests, just let us know. Also, please check out Safe Studio, where you'll find tools, toolkits, resources, videos, and so much more to help you be successful in the world of work. As always, if you appreciate this content, the greatest compliment you can give us is a referral to a friend or colleague. And if you feel so inclined, we do always appreciate those likes, comments, subscribes, and reviews on your podcast platform of choice. My name is Adam Mattis. Until next time, as they say, stay safe.